to say I'm soon going to be joined by an additional person doing the same role, because I'm currently national. So I don't really know the issues in Devon as well as I would do, for that reason, I suppose. But this is a relatively short session, and what I'm really aiming to do is to talk about the UKFS Forestry Standard, particularly landscape context, design principles and process, because they're really fundamental to the new woodland expansion agenda, and it's very important that they're better embedded and understood. But also, so I'm informing you really about those. Some of you will know them anyway, but also I'm very keen to inspire ideas, flag up some issues, and have a useful discussion. So it's very much a two-way thing, because a lot of you are real experts in Devon and the Devon issues that I'm not. So this has been a bit of a journey of discovery for me, and a few things have come out of putting together this presentation that I think hopefully quite useful. So just briefly, my role, as I've said, I'm got a national focus and in the policy advice team with a good range of other disciplines: historic environment, biodiversity, business and markets, climate change experts, and soon there'll be national capital people or person, and people like social foresters, very much about people and access, that kind of thing. And my role is to do what I'm doing now, really promote the guidance and develop best practice training and upskilling, because a lot of cases that I see often aren't UKFS compliant initially, and there's a lot of wasted time really getting them to become UKFS compliant. But I collaborate quite widely with the forestry sector, environmental and landscape sector. And then internally, I work closely with the PAT team, particularly biodiversity and historical environment. But I also have a landscape woodland network, meeting with colleagues from Natural England and national parks and AOMBs. Well, not everyone, just the landscape professionals within that group. So that's a really useful group that I work with a wider group of people outside the Forestry Commission. But one of my key roles was to modernise landscape analysis and design, because in its origin it was very much focused on visual matters, and there's been quite a long period, last 2 or 3 decades, where there hasn't been very significant scale of woodland creation. So we're really entering, well, you obviously don't need me to tell you there's a very significant landscape change about to happen, and it's very important that it's, as not only UKFS compliant, but it's really is as positive on a broader spectrum as it possibly could be. So there's an evolution of forestry and towards a diverse and multifunctional activity that meets a very wide range of objectives. Sometimes, of course, there's conflicts and difficulties, so resolving these issues is really important. Okay, so just to give you a bit of a roadmap, I'm going to talk a bit about the Forestry Standard, and particularly focus on the importance of landscape context, the design principles and process, which are embedded in the UKFS. And then I'm going to try and apply it to a few Devon scenarios. And as I say, we'll have discussions at the end. Okay, so I'm sure you all know what landscape is, but it's always worth repeating the definition from the European Landscape Convention: an area perceived by people whose character is the result of action and interaction of natural and human factors. So the reason I highlight that is a lot of people, as I've alluded to, think landscape is synonymous with visual, and of course visual matters are very much part of it, but and this is straight out of the UKFS, it is about the aesthetic qualities, visual and other perceptual impressions. But it's also very much about natural components, and the landform is well known, but it's very much about the biodiversity resource, the climate, the hydrology. You know, a landscape is holistic. It's everything, as you can see in this picture, that is relevant, but it's also the land use, the human influences, settlement, and the cultural values. So it's you know, it's really an overview that is so important to informed landscape change. And then the European Landscape Convention from the Council of Europe, not the EU, highlight that all landscape matters are important, not just protected landscape. So I know Devon has got, I think it's 35% protected landscape, which is compares the average of 25%, but that's still a lot of land that isn't designated. So the UKFS is the government's approach to sustainable forestry, and I'm just going to immediately go straight into one of my favourite requirements that's actually not in the landscape section, it's in the general forestry practice part of the document. And it says new woodlands should be located and designed to maintain and enhance, well, you can read it, visual and cultural and ecological value and the landscape character. So I think what's great about that is it really is emphasizing that woodland design is, you know, is holistic, and you know, the landscape section that forms one of the elements of sustainable forest management identified there. Landscape is the one that looks at landscape character and the visual characteristics, but it also looks at the design. So in a way, what I've realized is the two elements of design, if you like, that are very important in woodland creation are the more traditional silvicultural design, which is obviously very much about productive woodland, in particular with good yield classes, getting the soil and microclimate right. But also it's now very strongly related to ESC, which is the ecological site classification, that gives information about those trees, both native trees, but also productive trees from around the world, that are going to be climate change resilient in 2050 and 2080 for a particular site or part of the country. So that's obviously a very important driver for looking at woodland and the trees that would be within it. But you know, every bit as important and needing to go hand in hand is the broader woodland design that takes on board particularly the environmental and social aspects of design and fitting into the landscape character. So I suppose what my role is, it's sort of anti-silo really. It's, you know, I'm under landscape, but actually all those requirements and the guidelines in biodiversity, climate change, historic environment, people, and so on, are very relevant, of course, to the environmental and social aspect of the design. And I think it's really important to highlight that now, because you know, at this particular juncture, nature recovery is such a critical element in woodland design, and with the pandemic in particular, human health and well-being and access to nature is very high up in the agenda. So there's never been a time where good multi-functional design with a wide range of objectives has been more relevant. Landscape architects and forest design, woodland design has been around a long time, since the 1960s with Dame Sylvia Crow, and there's a huge quantity of guidance on it. What I try and do though is, I think it's so easy for people to get lost in all this great stuff, which is very interesting. And I try to focus on the really important things to get good understanding and a good practice. So UKFS really is about a landscape-led approach, and I think the three most important things that people need to take away are the importance of analysing landscape context, and that is a requirement in the landscape section. Understanding its processes, human and natural, but particularly taking an integrated approach. It's not just about the visual design, it's actually about how everything works and fits together. So it's we work in multidisciplinary teams very typically, and it's really balancing how new woodland appears and fits in a landscape, but also how it functions for operationally, for people, for wildlife, and for climate resilience, and water management in many cases, and many other things. So that's the key thing, taking the right time to understand the landscape context, and that includes the site itself, particularly with larger sites. There's a lot going on in them. They're not blank sheets of paper. The second thing is, hopefully you'll be aware there are forest design principles in the UKFS. There's 7. They've been around a long time, and they are very useful at all stages of woodland design. So their application is informed by the landscape context, so the two fit together well, and they really do help address complex landscape and visual issues with the key goal of achieving a balanced solution. So they're requirements, they're really important tools. The final thing is the forest design process, which it's not rocket science at all. It's just a very straightforward process that goes through a logical sequence. It's transparent because it's graphically based with lots of visual material, so it's accessible to all stakeholders and communities really. But it's also an iterative process, so it doesn't, it's not just, you don't just go in one direction. Depending on what comes up through survey work, there might need to be some additional survey work, fine-tuning of the design. That's all very much part of it. So it's a very practical tool for woodland design. And I'm only going to touch on these things in this presentation, but I do quite detailed training courses, giving more explanation of these. So the forest design process is well known by landscape architects for all situations, but in woodland design it's particularly good for engaging such a wide range of stakeholders that are interested in woodland creation, and particularly communities. You don't need reminding, but modern woodland creation is about large scale. Our country has very diverse landscapes and lots of complex objectives. There's particularly ambitious and productive, particularly ambitious targets, and productive woodland is high up there on the agenda, but also multifunctional benefits, as I've been discussing. So that's important, as is the need for climate change resilience, particularly in a county like Devon, so far south, but throughout the country. And then also the fact that Devon in particular, as I've highlighted, has a huge amount of designated landscapes percentage-wise, but really the country does as a whole. And with 159 national character areas, England, on a global perspective, is very diverse, and it's very key to our national and local identity, that distinctiveness. So that's a really important thing. And the integrated woodland design approach that looks at the big picture and looks to resolve a whole range of different complex issues is really critical to getting the quality of woodland fitting into enhancing and evolving our landscapes, that approach is critical. So just a bit of summary on that then. So landscape is a holistic approach, and after all, it does provide the setting for all new woodland creation. And it's very much about bringing the elements of sustainable forestry management together. It's very much about bringing things together. And as I've said, it's about how things look, yes, very much about the visual and the perceptual, but just as important is how new woodland functions for a very broad range of objectives. Understanding the landscape and visual resource is really essential, and it underpins UKFS compliant woodland design. And if woodlands aren't if they aren't UKFS compliant, they have to go back to the drawing board. So it makes perfect sense to aim to get it right first time by understanding these guidelines, UKFS guidelines. So I'm actively involved in, and my colleague will be reviewing and commenting on cases across the country. So also in terms of meeting the targets and the timescales, getting it right is even more important than it ever has been. Otherwise, there's potentially going to be delays and additional costs. So inevitably, there'll be increased public scrutiny and expectation for woodland expansion, and it's really critical that it's well planned and designed in accord with the UKFS, and that people feel they can be engaged in it, which is why the design process helps a lot. Okay. Right, starting with landscape context, the importance of baseline analysis. I think one thing to highlight is this whole process isn't. Landscape architects are, in many ways, those that understand woodland design are very suitable for this kind of work, but most of it is undertaken by other professionals. Foresters, of course, and land agents. And so my role is about upskilling the landscape profession and hoping that as the expansion increases, there'll be a bigger role for landscape architects and landscape professionals. But it's also, my role is also about upskilling, all those involved in woodland creation. So I'm going to say more about the design principles. In fact, I'm going to say quite a lot about them. So the design principles, spirit of place, I've subtitled local distinctiveness for better understanding of what it actually means. The same with unity, the landscape fit. So they're the higher level, but really essential starting point for landscape context, rather than going straight into, there's a real temptation to walk into a site and start planning what trees are going to go where before you actually get to grips with the site and its character. So they're really important, and I push those very strongly. And now the next two in kind of order of application really are land, form and pattern of enclosure, because the UKFS suggests that early part of your woodland design you need to understand whether landform or pattern enclosure are the main drivers for the design, the woodland design. And in fact, it couldn't be more appropriate in Devon, because I think in terms of iconic distinctiveness, it's the patterns of enclosure in Devon that are very high up there, very distinctive, and more so than anywhere. And I do recall reading over the last day or two that there's 53,000 kilometres of hedgerow in Devon, which is more than any other English county. So that's, as we go on, you realise I'll say more and more about pattern of enclosure. And then the final three are shape, scale and diversity, all really important, but a little bit more understandable. So the next thing to highlight is, in order to understand landscape context, and that is the surrounds and the setting of a site, but also the site itself. Landscape character appraisal is necessary, and it's based on existing guidelines from Natural England and GLVIA, but it's I'm working on 3 levels so that it's a fit for purpose or appropriate for the complexity and the sensitivity of the site. So that's critical, and that's something I'm embedding in all cases. And then oh, apologies. And then at this stage, this landscape context stage, in the design process, there's 2 outputs that are really important, 2 graphic outputs, the landscape context plan and the site appraisal plan. So they really embed the need to take not only sort of study and evaluate and appraise the landscape character, but also there's 2 drawings that actually pick out the headlines, pick out the aspects of the setting and the site that are really going to be very relevant in the shaping of the woodland design. So, okay, talk a lot about design principles, but the important thing, of course, is every site is unique, and I'm just gonna go through them again. These aren't in any particular order, but these are tried and tested principles, and I think they're a very good checklist at all stages of design to fine-tune designs, use them to communicate with stakeholders, and just a checklist to be sure that these things have been considered. So just a bit of flagging up some images. This is one of the most incredible sites I've visited in England, actually, that is in Cumbria. But it just had it was just it ticked so many kind of interesting boxes, in as far as you had a very ancient little settlement in the middle distance. You had sites of the fells, and behind me there was a huge limestone massif with small lead lime and limestone grassland behind me. And then in the middle of the site here, apologies, was an incredible mosaic of mire and kind of almost natural rockeries, incredibly species rich, with a lot of semi-natural woodland and scrub regeneration. So it was a sort of a very unusual place, and I'm sure these similar places do exist, obviously, in Devon. And here's one of them. This is in the north of Devon, in Exmoor. This incredible combination of steep-sided combes with a lot of mature, probably ancient woodland, broadleaf woodland, with heathland, and then a very distinctive enclosure pattern, and obviously rolling hills and open moorland beyond that. So just this incredible composition of diverse features, ancient diverse features, that just make the place so distinctive. But through a lot of Devon, it really is the pattern of enclosure that gives it a spirit of place on a county level. And it's not all pasture. There's of course arable farming, and then when there is, the incredible Devon redland soils up here that, for someone like me coming from the southeast, is very striking and really distinctive. And it's quite an interesting contrast, the pasture with these red arable soils. So this is an extract from the UKFS Forest and Landscape section, and I particularly showed you this because it is about pattern and a pattern of enclosure, and it's a good point to highlight the fact that the UKFS document is being reviewed, and that's not particularly because of the current woodland ambition and expansion. it is reviewed on a regular basis, but it's a very interesting time, and there's a few things in here that do highlight the need for it to be reviewed. But as well as pattern, this is just about the only reference to Devon in probably the whole document, so I thought it would be quite nice to show this image, this extract. And it talks about, woodlands in landscapes with strong enclosure patterns. So that, as I've said, as you know, does apply to large, well, probably the majority of the Devon countryside and landscape. Now, what it says in a lower image, it's giving an idea of how you can fit woodland into these patterns of enclosure. Very historic, it's ancient countryside largely. But what it does show is actually very kind of small scale extensions, very sensitively fitted in corners of fields and on maybe some uplands with bracken, extensive bracken, increasing the connectivity, and also avoiding geometric woodland structure shape. So, but what struck me, of course, is we are talking currently about large scale woodland planting. So that's something that might be addressed in the revised document, and needs to be really. But what it does say, the two numbers beneath the images are guidelines that support requirements. So the requirement would be to understand and study the landscape context, and this is the requirement going into the detail of the design principle pattern of enclosure. So it says, you have to analyze the pattern of enclosure and where it is a dominant influence, as it is, as I said, through most of Devon. The land, you need to use this to guide the nature of the woodland planting. And it also says in comment 24 is use new woodlands to reinforce and extend the enclosure pattern and avoid the imposition of extensive forests and important landscapes that detract from the enclosure pattern. So I think there's quite a bit of tension and challenge in the way things will be developing in the next few years because of the current need for an ambition for tree planting, woodland creation. So I think we need to be very clever and update ideas of how we can retain the really important areas of enclosure that are of great significance, but in some cases, maybe they're a framework for more significant woodland creation. So that's perhaps something we'll just discuss a bit later on. So unity is the other high level design principle for me that I subtitle landscape fit, because I think that just helps people understand what it means a bit more. And one of the key things is about interlock. This is right at the other end of the country on the borders with Scotland, so you've got very extensive Sitka spruce plantations. But here you've got in the foreground, this is just taken from a sort of a small lane. You've got an old farmstead that's got a new tourist function, I think. But in the foreground, you've got a lot of sort of natural willow regeneration. You've got some wetland areas and some ponds, and if that wasn't there, there wouldn't be a unity within that landscape. There's a good sense of diversity and a more organic relationship between the two types of woodland. This is in Devon, and what I'd highlight here really is you've got a river corridor. I think they're willows, white willows, willow scrub at the lower part of the image, with some more mixed woodland. I think I can see larch and spruce, broadleaves, just at the lower part of the slopes, and then you're going higher up to more traditional pasture with tree lines and scattered trees, and as a sort of composition fits together quite well, and there's a certain harmony in that image, but you can also see there's plenty of scope for some sensitively placed and designed woodland within that image. I suppose another key thing in terms of the design principles is scale, and I think in Devon it's typical. You've got both very intimate scale, the narrow hedged lanes, smaller scale landscapes on the outskirts of settlement and in the valley bottoms where people frequent more, and then you've got the bigger scale landscape with, in this case, a very large scale productive woodland on the top of the ridge there, with a very pronounced pattern of enclosure in between the two. So again, that's just quite this is up towards Exmoor. It's quite an interesting range of landscape characters and views, and yeah, just the consideration of where New Woodland might fit into that landscape. So again, in North Devon, we've got an existing level of diversity quite well illustrated again in this photograph, with the prominent fill pattern in the valley bottom, productive agricultural land, very traditional looking, with sort of more the heathland, where the landform not enclosed land, with heathland in the foreground and woodland on the slopes on both sides of the valley, with more open moorland beyond, and really important diversity that's so important scenically, and why this is a designated landscape and is extremely important for people and tourism. But there's a unity. It fits together really well, but it's how, even designated landscapes are always dynamic anyway, but there will be landscape changes, there will be woodland expansion, and it's just looking at where it would appropriately go, and what scale it would be. So you could imagine just north, just up from the valley, there's already quite a bit of woodland on the lower slopes. Whether that would expand further up, or whether there's more scope to include woodland within that fill pattern in the valley bottom, for example. Shape is another design principle I'd mentioned. I think in this case, the fill pattern is the main contributor to shape in the Devon landscape. But then when you're out of the enclosed areas, the shape is obviously far more organic and rolling. So the woodland design would need to respond to that, and I'll say more about that later. So generally speaking, the pattern of enclosure is the key factor that's relevant to woodland design in Devon. Often it's a bit of both, but in this case, the enclosure isn't. This is going more in the moorlands and the uplands, and landform is the key factor. So this looks like it's fairly naturally regenerating and developed woodland, but typically in the uplands, there's something called visual force analysis that highlights the hollows and the ridges, and the woodland types and character relates very closely to the landform. That's probably a lot more appropriate in the north of England than it is down here. So just again emphasizing that point, diversity, there's great diversity in this image where the landform dominates, but you've got really nice interlock actually. You can see in the foreground, you've got natural colonization, got the heathland and the woodland. It's all very, it's not just visually pleasing, but actually from an ecological functioning and resilience point of view, it's also incredibly good. just a slide highlighting diversity at all scales. I think we always need to think about the landscape scale, but also the human scale in any woodland creation. And that there's a lot of talk about coarse grain and fine grain. I think that's probably just another way of saying landscape scale and human scale. This was a photograph I took, I think, on my last visit to Exeter, well over a year ago now, unfortunately. But I think there's an important point here. This is demonstrating. This was just looking over a gate from a country lane. I was just struck by how attractive it looked. So again, it's this human scale diversity. It's incredibly valuable for, obviously, for wildlife, for people, and you know, this distinctive character really would need to be integrated into new woodland. You know, it's all too easy to plant up the spaces between the trees, or in some cases take out some trees and plant new ones. But you know, as you all know, woodland isn't just about a complete coverage. It's actually about integrating those important characteristics and features within a bigger woodland. That's even more important in large scale woodlands. So I would, you know, you've got anthills indicating species rich and ancient pasture there in the foreground. You know, you've got open grown trees, you've got scrub, very well structured, going to be very important ecologically. So these are exactly the sort of elements of a larger site you'd pick up on a site appraisal plan. And in some ways it is quite a landscape thing, because, you know, it's striking scenically, but it also embraces you know, human perceptions and ecology as well. So okay, so that's covered the design process. So the third aspect was the forest design. Sorry, covered the design principles briefly, and this is the forest design process. So this is within the UKFS document, but it's not that prominent. So I've highlighted this because I think it is really with the ambition for functional benefits, you know, and the larger scale nature and the pace of new woodland creation. It's more important than ever that woodlands are designed in a logical process that is, again, tried and tested, and really helps to get from A to B in a very efficient manner. So just to highlight things again, landscape context plan, looking beyond the site, picking up those elements that are going to be relevant to what sort of woodland and what character of woodland is appropriate at a site. So that it's survey, but it's also got that analytical and evaluating element to it. So that's often on an OS base. Because of time, I'm not going to show you a lot of examples of these, but I do training with a lot more detail on the things I'm saying now. The second stage in the full analysis is to you know, take the site and pick out elements of particular value that add to the distinctiveness and the quality of the place. So that last photograph I showed you, with a lot of elements coming together, would be an area that would be zoned within a much bigger site. So there might be large parts of the site that are almost like a blank sheet of paper, that would be very suitable for you know, if you like, less nuanced woodland creation, more broad brush treatment, you know, productive in particular. So the zoning element of the site appraisal is really important, because it's not just identifying the geography of the site and where the important existing elements are, but it also enables you to think of connections between habitats for public access, along watercourses, you know, breaking down the scale of a large forest if there's a large productive forest with a lot of productive conifers, for example, rather than having huge expanses of it in a smaller scale landscape like Devon. You know, you can break that down with corridors or broadleaves or open space networks. So it's you know, it just fits better into that landscape setting and the character. But the really important thing as a product of these two earlier stages is the synthesis. So it's actually bringing together an early design concept that is informed by the context plan, the appraisal plan, the design principles. And there's two really important things about this stage is they're intended for you know, working drawing really intended to as a tool for engagement with, you know, all those stakeholders and communities who are interested in the scheme and will have an input into the scheme. But also it's very important and quite appropriate to have options as well. So rather than just going for one design, as we all know, there's all different options. So that's often quite useful and facilitates engagement. So people have an you know, better idea of how you can fit things together. But the other crucial thing is it's not just plan based. You need a plan, of course, but it's really helpful to support these with photographs, annotated photographs, and also perspectives from viewpoints. That also helps to explain, to tell the story, if you like, of where the design is going, the woodland design is going, and how it can be influenced potentially and fine-tuned. Okay. So this is an image we've already seen earlier on. It's quite a typical of, albeit bird's eye view of a part of Devon, I'm not sure where, but what I love about it actually, and although I'm afraid it's not that sharp, but what I like about it is it really highlights Devon's enclosure pattern, but it also shows there's a lot of variety within that enclosure. So, and this is part of this landscape character appraisal. So just thought I'd flag up a few things. I think that catches your eye most of all is that there's a core of broadleaf woodland that is quite extensive, but it also has fields within it, an edge. I think both from a human perspective and ecologically, edge is incredibly valuable and adds so much diversity. And so that's something to point out there. To the left side, you've got what looks like quite a prominent hill, quite a short distance before you get to some more woodland. So that immediately catches my eye as, although it's visually prominent, there are you know, there are opportunities to make a connection, a woody connection between those two large bits of woodland. Beyond, towards the top of the image, it's striking to me that there's far more geometric and large scale fields. But they also, to the left and the right, there are other woodlands. So I don't know whether that's important for other things, breeding waders or species-rich meadows, but from a purely looking at it from the enclosure pattern point of view, there may be strong opportunities for woodland creation in that area. And then the other things I think to point out is just to the right of the central woodland, there's these tree-lined irregular fields that are really quite interesting. And you seem to be entering a more ancient organic sort of countryside where the hedges and the field boundaries were carved out of the ancient woodland. So that's striking. And then you've got more prominent tree lines, riparian corridors. So there might be opportunities to widen those, or for various reasons, it might, you know, they might be just good the way they are. And then, of course, you've got farmland settlements, small settlements where you know, ideally most people probably will want woodland creation right up to their back door or the edge of their property. So yeah, as I say, guideline 23 is about analysing the enclosure pattern. And I guess with drones, and we're getting so much more familiar with looking at the landscape from above. I mean, with lockdown, I've been watching all these celebrity walking programs, and, you know, it seems like a very high percentage of those are taken from this kind of perspective, perhaps a bit closer down. But it is incredible. But I guess unless we go up on balloons and so on, you know, it's a tool, but it's not the only perspective, of course, of looking at landscape. I mentioned 3D perspectives. This is just a very broad brush analysis at the early stages, just getting to grips with a landscape. This is snow-capped fells. It's not going to be Devon. It is in Cumbria again. My next favourite county, I suppose. But you know, it's just you know, doing a simple analysis of that view from a viewpoint, and thinking how, you know, how distinctively different the layers and the different character zones is quite straightforward. But obviously, it's very relevant when you want to integrate new woodland into a landscape like this. So it's a simple broad brush analysis, stoning the character types, as I've mentioned before, and really picking up the local distinctiveness. And I think there's very few landscapes in England that are as distinctive as the Lake District National Park. But certainly Devon comes very close. Well, in fact, probably equal, I better say. Okay, I mentioned this is just going through some of the outputs. This is a small site, but very interesting and diverse site in the middle of Bedfordshire. And I think it's just trying to demonstrate, looking at the site and its immediate context and picking up some really important elements that are going to influence the woodland design. You know, in this case, there was a scheduled ancient monument, a derelict grand house on a prominent ridge. This is a green sand ridge, and it's right by long distance footpaths. It's very visible, so it's not a good idea to completely screen that out. So a wood pasture option on the sloping ground beside it was seen as a good way forward for tree planting, woodland creation. And then, you know, in this case, there was acid grassland. There was a lot of existing regeneration and hedgerows, and so on. So this is really a tool just to sort of give a sense of the capacity for woodland creation on what was quite a sensitive site in quite a sensitive context. This was a site appraisal of a existing large woodland trust site just north of London that was 10 years beyond establishment, and it was a bit of a review that I undertook with the Woodland Trust to flesh out some issues that might be influence the woodland management from now on, but would be just as relevant from the word go. So the main point of showing you these it's based on an aerial photograph. There's headings and then a little bit of narrative just to flag up very accessible aspects of the site that make it distinctive and are very relevant to how the woodland design would develop. For example, this is going to be very well used by people on the edge of London, and indeed it's a hugely popular place because it's given large-scale open access to a lot of people, and it's obviously very welcomed. But because it's 10 years old, some parts of the site on a sort of flat plateau are quite secluded, and you haven't got any outside references. So one of the things I've suggested is, you know, sight lines or vistas to local landmarks. So local village has a prominent church steeple on a slope. For example, that would be a sort of navigation point to help wayfaring. do I mean that? Wait, navigation and legibility through the woodland, but also the use of more diversity in the planting and actually considering how people move through a new woodland. So having nodes and within at key points, you might use different distinctive trees just to give it a strong sense of identity that's different from otherwise just a very large scale area of maybe oak and birch and hazel or something, something that is so it's thinking about human scale. It's thinking about how people, what draws people through a woodland, what makes people feel comfortable and inspired, these kind of things. And from that, the concept design was developed in a more of a zoning fashion. So the heart of the new forest, the entrance, the arrival points, how people decide which way they're going, areas that are really important for farmland birds and aren't going to be planted up, and considering the transition between the woodland and the open areas, and also potential recreational disturbance, all these kind of nuances. But actually, they with a good sort of walk around the site and desk study kind of work like this, they do generally stand out, and it's just capturing those so that it can inform the design process. Okay, I don't believe it. I think I finished this session exactly on time, which is a bit of a first for me, but I hope you found that interesting, and I will I'm happy to take any questions, or if Melanie wants to open the discussion.
Thanks very much, Richard. That's really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in the chat. There's a couple of themes emerging, and they're more discussion points really than maybe questions. So, but really interesting stuff. So firstly, Siri and Charlotte kind of both picked up on the tension really between the desire to conserve the pattern of enclosure and the sort of the natural regeneration of the rewilding aspect, and should we really stick to conserving the character of the area, whereas should we work with natural processes? So Siri and Charlotte. Siri, let's go with you first. Do you want to add anything to that?
Hi, thanks Melanie and Richard. Yeah, quite a tricky one to start with. I thought I'd throw it in there because I know it is in a sorry Richard.
It's a very important one, yeah.
Could you just say where you who you are and where you come from?
Yeah,
that would be good.
So Siri Frost, I work at the Environment Agency, so heavily involved in natural flood management, working with natural processes, and obviously then bringing in that tree planting, woodland establishment, but also the full range of sort of thinking about hydrology. And yeah, so very aware of the tensions that can occur between obviously landscape character, potentially preservation, versus looking forward and natural processes, and it's just trying to think how we all work together to overcome those tensions, but collectively, rather than sort of forming separate routes and heading off in separate directions.
Can I answer that, Siri?
Please.
Mel. So, okay. Yeah. In fact, I used to work. Well, I worked for the Environment Agency for many years, so I fully understand what you're saying, natural flood management and so on. And I think obviously there's this obvious tension between, if you like, the preservation. Well, people talk about, and in the UKFS it refers to conserve and enhance. But in more recent times, I've heard an expression, enhance and evolve. And I think because of the kind of magnitude of this landscape scale change, it's why it's so important to get landscape aware people involved in this, because its landscape will change quite significantly in both Devon and in designated landscapes in places. But I think why what I've been saying is so crucial. I think if these these processes and design principles and this approach is really embedded throughout the forestry and woodland creation sector with all people, and you know, there's a what's the word, a holistic and integrated approach to design of woodland. That's the best way we can you know, get to what we want. You know, there will be landscape change, but we retain those areas that are particularly distinctive or iconic, and we, you know, we don't just, yeah, we take a respectful attitude towards the landscape and the environment, and of course its economic value as well, you know, in all its forms. So I think all I'm trying to say is that this is a sort of set of techniques and tools that on both planning scale, large landscape scale, and more detailed woodland design, that really are the, you know, the route to getting a balance, you know, and getting a sort of compromise and resolving often competing objectives.
Thanks, Richard. Charlotte, is there anything you'd like to add? Because I know you've made a few comments on this.
Thank you. I'm Charlotte Rathbone, landscape architect at Rathbone Partnership. Yes, it's been very interesting, and we are always dealing with this tension between this very special landscape, the very special landscape characteristics in Devon, and the small scale. That's the crucial thing. I think we have a small scale topography, enclosures, villages, culturally, all sorts, small scale. So any woodland we need to consider needs to reflect that. I think that's crucial. And also I think we are moving forward, and I love the word evolve. That is exactly what we are. We are designers. Yikes, we go into the future. We need to be informed and reflect the past, work out, analyze, as our job does, analyze what's crucial and the priority aspects of a landscape, and then work with those to go forward. With BNG, I thought this very interesting point given by Leslie, I think, about orchards. We can't just think about woodlands. We've got to both think about trees in all their forms. I think this should be the conversation. Hedgerow trees, orchards, all these other aspects of trees in the Devon landscape. I'm talking about Devon particularly. Okay. Yeah, forward we go. We need to change this iconic, slightly open landscape for something that perhaps would have looked like 500, 600 years ago. We need to think in those timescales, really. Yeah.
Can I just come back on that, Mel, briefly?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, I think a really good point. Thank you. I just would like to highlight that the Forestry Commission are looking quite widely now, and trees outside woodlands are you know, an important topic that the Forestry Commission are involved in. But also there's England's, well, it's currently called, I think, England Tree Strategy. So as I've said, with the UKFS is being reviewed, there's you know, things are changing in terms of some of those issues you highlight. You know, the bigger picture about trees and tree planting and all the importance of orchards. I totally agree with you there. I was just going to make another point. Oh yeah, the large scale thing in Devon's relatively, you know, generally intimate scale. I think you know, the very large scale woodland is much more likely to be taking place in parts of the north of England where there are very large scale open landscapes. So I think, although I think, as you say, fitting into Devon's character will be, you know, part of that will be to create the right scale of new woodland and make the connections and so on. That's going to, you know, as I say, respond to the distinctiveness of the county. So, you know, England's not all going to be the same in terms of the type of woodland and and the scale of woodland. So with all the people involved and people listening now, you know, there's a really high level of expertise and interest in woodland creation. So hopefully I'm reassuring you that there is the tools and techniques and UKFS, the need for UKFS compliance to make sure that happens, you know, appropriate woodland creation for Devon.
Richard, while we're on the subject of scale, Tim Youngs has made the point about, you know, where do we put large scale woodlands in Devon? I think that was another question that Siri had before the meeting. So if we potentially target our more large scale landscapes, which in Devon maybe are the open plateau tops, the areas on with the later enclosures which have larger scale, maybe those are the more less sensitive ones for large scale woodland, and we've highlighted that. Then you know, that brings up other issues about views. For example, when in the East Devon and Blackdown Hills A&Bs, a very distinctive a valued characteristic is this fantastic views you get from these scarp edges looking out. And yeah, Tim, I didn't know if you wanted to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered most of it, I think, Mel. It was just a skyline point as well, because we've traditionally been pretty well, not worried, but aware of the you know, if you put large new productive woodlands on hilltops, that affects skylines. And so I'm wondering if there's been an evolution in the new guidance to just be a bit less worried about that or not.
Well, the UKFS review won't be out for a year or so, but what I'm working on is when my new colleague starts next month or so, we're working on a more specific level of guidance, supplementary guidance, that would cover that level of detail. But I think it's interesting, actually. I was involved in a scheme up in Cumbria where there was a ridge. There was wanting to productive woodland. There's a lot of Sitka in the context, typical large scale Sitka woodland. And what we actually did, because this was a sort of a different landscape type, much more diversity in smaller scale, we used the top. We planted broadleaves or recommended broadleaves on the more prominent skyline, and then the Sitka band was more in the mid slopes, and then you had broadleaves lower down on the edge of a river valley. So in a way, it was kind of sandwiched, you know, not just with bands, it wasn't, you know, but sensitively relating to the landform and the other features and the existing features and the pattern of enclosure. So, you know, there are ways with the right amount of time and analysis and concept development to, if you do have skyline conifers, actually just, you know, have them in scale, a scale that isn't too intrusive or overbearing. You know, particularly if it's a more intimate landscape like East Devon. So I think that's exactly the sort of, that's a bit of a topic. You know, I'm working on topics of how to integrate new woodland into enclosure pattern, or on different perspectives. You know, from landscape scale viewpoints, looking into a site, from then going right into when people are walking through a site, how existing hedgerows of different quality might form part of an open space system, whether they're just incorporated into the edge of the woodland. There's a good existing sort of an instant woodland. all those kind of things. Yeah, I think the
Sorry, I don't know who is. Right, I think that's Debbie Sweet who's just joined. Sorry.
Okay, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned the open plateaus, because I was looking at the cover. I'll show a slide soon. Looking at the cover of the NCAs for was it the South Devon AONB? I'm not I think I can't remember the name of the NCA exactly, but there was an excellent photograph capturing the character of the Rea, the sort of meandering watercourse with Coombe Woodland, and then smaller fields along the river. And as you get to the open plateau, you know, you were very aware there were very large open areas of big scale fields, and it immediately struck me that, you know, that in Devon context, that is the obvious place for larger scale, well designed, multifunctional woodland, as you've just highlighted, Mel. So that's it. It's interesting that, you know, well, obviously you've thought about a long time, but it's I think it's helpful when we, you know, we kind of think similar things, and there are some opportunities, you know. I mean, are there any other? I mean, I suppose the other thing we haven't talked about is the full spectrum of woodland, different woodlands in different places, and the different techniques for establishing woodland cover. But I expect we'll come on to that in the next session.
Richard, we've got a couple more topics really to discuss, but I'm conscious that we could, because we've got, well, we could just take one more and just maybe allow a 5-minute overrun on the break. But sorry, Mel. The other thing is to say what they are, and then I could, you know, highlight them in what I'm saying in the next session potentially. Okay, so one is to do, it's a bit more broader than this topic really, and it's the issue of broadleaves not providing enough economic return, and, you know, the need to have a mixed productive woodland, and how you perhaps relate that to Devon, which I think you've probably touched on anyway. So Julian and Matt made those points. So Julian, I don't know if you want to add anything more to that comment for Richard.
Yes, hi. Yeah, I mean, this is looking as a, sorry, Julian Birchby, I'm Regional Manager and Chartered Forester for Prior and Rickett. So we're quite heavily involved in woodland creation, and it's certainly been a big part of my career. And commerciality is always front and centre with owners. And I'm looking at several schemes at the moment where the finances have to work, and in order for them to work, commercial conifer is a really important consideration in the design, and I think it can be incorporated into a woodland, and we've done so, you know, with maybe 2/3 conifer, and it blends in very well. Yeah, and it's, whilst all of this landscape design stuff is great, and I don't disagree with it, there is that thing of, well, you know, are landowners, particularly farmers, willing to pay for the time involved? And the grant support that's there for the planning isn't sufficient to cover a great deal of time. Because
you're obviously aware of the Woodland Creation Planning Grant.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, we're using that at the moment, but it's still fairly tight. Sorry? It's still relatively tight on many schemes in terms of, because obviously landscape is only a part of what we're looking at in that process.
Well,
it's difficult to give it too much time.
Yeah, the thing is, landscape isn't just another thing to tick off. You know, landscape is about the biodiversity, historic environment. It's about looking at the big picture and bringing everything together. So with, you know, landscape character appraisal at that early stage should be able to flag up, you know, all those really important issues that are going to be relevant to woodland design in quite a sort of a headline type form, you know, but also geographically referenced across the site and the setting. So you know, these are things that have to be done now. So and the Woodland Creation Planning Grant isn't going anywhere, and it's I think it's I mean, it's up to £30,000. So if that's well spent, I think the thing is about the landscape character appraisal input, it's not like going away for a month and producing a really thick report. It's actually very much a practical tool for informing the woodland design. So, you know, it's balancing the silvicultural and economic objectives, which, as you say, are really extremely important, with what the site tells you, what the context tells you, and what the other objectives would be. So it's actually what I would like to stress really is, I think kind of a landscape-led or place-led approach to woodland creation actually is a really efficient and effective way of getting a multi-benefit woodland on the go, so saving money all round and time. So it's, you know, say the landscape stuff is good, it's slightly suggesting it's just another thing somewhere, a bit of a nice to do, you know, another box to tick. It's not like that at all. It's actually front and centre, you know, about what woodland design is about, and it needs to start from day one.
Matt, have you got anything to add to that?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Matthew O'Connell from Silverwood Agriculture Limited. I work with a number of farms on, we're looking at woodland creation, but I also work with them on the nutritional side. So I work with dairies and beef farms. And generally, as a rule, we get land agents recommending that changes shouldn't be taking place at the moment or in the foreseeable future until financial gains are given. That could be 5 or 10 years' time, which, as we're looking at planting as soon as possible, are there going to be more financial incentives going forward?
Well, I think what I can tell you is I think there's going to be an announcement in the next month or so about the new grant schemes. I don't know if Roland is around, but I'm pretty sure there's going to be a lot of high-level announcements in the next month or so, including you know, more details about the grants and incentives. But I can't really say any more than that. But I think the whole landscape, if you like, the financial and economic landscape will be changing, as well as
Roland, I don't know if you've got anything to add. Roland, if you're there, anything?
Unfortunately, I can't add anything more to Richard. We're all embargoed from giving too much more detail at the moment. But we are working on a new woodland creation financial offer, which will hopefully be available later this year and launched in the not too distant future. That's probably all I can say at the moment.
Okay.
I appreciate the financial constraints on landowners and the uncertainty. Certainly looking into the sort of medium term with ELM and things like that. I definitely take that on board, what Julian and Matt, the points they were making.
Okay, thanks, Roland. At that point, I think we'll stop the questions. I know there's some more and there's hands up as well, but I'm just conscious of wanting to get through it. And I know some people have to leave at 12, so we're quite keen to get through the part 2. So I think what we'll do is we'll break now for 10 minutes or just under 10 minutes, and we'll make a start again at 11. And if I could just ask Ross, if you could just stay on and we'll have a quick chat while everybody goes to break. So I'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, Melanie.
Hello, thanks for joining today. Yeah, I just thought it'd be quick chat. Are you okay to say about the More Trees for Devon initiative to everybody when we come back from the break as the first thing?
Yeah, no, that'd be fine. I could just do that really, really quickly, just a minute or two, and just, you know, obviously lock the context for this session today being really key to that as being very much part and parcel of that. But yeah, I'd literally do that in a minute or two. Is that okay? I know it's
That's
slightly
brilliant.
diverts.
Yeah, no, that's good. And I also want to just very, very briefly tell people about the Right Place, Right Tree guidance and where we're at with that. So yeah, and then pass over to Richard to take part 2. So yeah. Yeah,
what's Richard going to cover in part 2 then, in terms of that right tree, right place? How far do we get into that?
No, not at all. He's going to be looking at some case studies and applying them. so they kind of echo the guidance we've got in the Right Place, Right Tree guidance, but not. I don't know how much he's going to delve into the guidance. He's seen the draft, but that's as far as it goes at the moment. So we shall see.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Really useful to understand that. So I'll see you back at 11 then. And yeah, if you introduce, and I'll just do it very quickly. That's
fantastic. Great. Thanks very much.
Cheers.
All right. Cheers.
Hi, Mel. Hello.
Hello, everybody.
Hello.
Welcome back to part 2. Thanks for joining us again. Hope you managed to get tea and have a bit of a break. Yeah, we can really interesting section coming up. So we're focusing a bit more on Devon and applying all these principles and processes to some case studies. So before I hand over to Rick, I just want
Mel, just to say we can't hear you very clearly.
Things, which is oh, you can't hear me. I've had a message.
Not very clearly. You seem to
You're
be
very quiet, Mel.
Hear me? Don't know why. I'm not on mute.
Don't worry, we can hear you. You're just a bit quieter. That's all.
Can you just let me know if
There you go.
Oh, you'd think I'd know by now.
Oh,
We've
that's
had a
better.
year of this. Oh, rookie error. Anyway, right. So welcome back, everybody. Thank you for joining us again, and I hope you had a good break. So we're going to focus now on Devon, and before I hand over to Richard, just want to highlight 2 things which are happening in Devon. The first is about the More Trees for Devon initiative, and I'm going to just hand over to Ross Kennelly very briefly, who is chairing that group, to tell you a bit about that. So Ross, would you like to carry on?
Yeah, no, thank you, Mel. Yeah, I'm Ross Kennelly. I'm Regional Director at the Woodland Trust. Although for this very short introduction, I'm going to take my Woodland Trust hat off, and my role actually is the Trees for Devon. I'm representing the Trees for Devon initiative that sits with the Devon Local Nature Partnership. And just very briefly, there is a coordinated group now working in Devon to see how we can grapple with these challenges of accelerated woodland creation. And that group involves, I chair that on behalf of the Local Nature Partnership, but it involves Caroline representing COM4, Caroline Eyre, John Burgess from Forestry Commission, and Melanie from Devon County Council. And we're working with a much wider group of interested parties. But basically, the aim is to take this guidance that's now coming forward and to see how we can move at scale, at pace, but all around the right tree in the right place. So it's a piece of work that actually we're now waiting for the Forestry Commission announcement around the new grants. We think that will probably be a catalyst to change. And we're waiting for the England, I think it's the Woodland Action Plan, as it will now be, which we think might talk about how we might work at a county level to take forward woodland creation at scale. So it's really not much more to say, Mel, other than that work is underway. And we do want to hear voices from across all of the sectors, and we are seeking those actively. But it's really good to have this guidance coming forward now into the county to help us take it forward.
Thanks, Ross. Siri Frost has asked whether we've got a group, a representative from the Environment Agency. I don't think we have, so it's Siri, you may be it. So yes, please liaise with Ross separately, and the more the merrier, and the more partners we can link into and unite into this woodland creation army. That's great. So right, the other thing I briefly want to tell you about is some guidance that a partnership project's been working on, and we've called it the Right Place, Right Tree, as opposed to Right Tree, Right Place, because it's landscape led. So we're looking at promoting this message that Richard is telling us about today in a Devon context. So we want to tell people about how to use our fantastic landscape character assessments, and also use our amazing Devon County Council Environment Viewer as well, because that's a huge source of, something's frozen. Hopefully I'm not frozen. Somebody's frozen. Anyway, hopefully they sort that out. So yes, it's a bit of guidance which Fiona Fife Associates has been working on for us. And when I say us, this is a partnership project between Devon County Council, two of our AONBs, East Devon AONB and Black Downs, the Woodland Trust, and also we've got well, the Forestry Commission officers have helped us as well in support in various aspects. So we hope it's in draft at the moment. It's going through some review following user group feedback, or we will be doing that. So we've had a targeted focus group looking at it. So we intend to put that guidance on the Devon Local Nature Partnership website. We're going to issue that as a consultation draft to a wider stakeholder group, and I very much hope everybody listening here will be interested to see the guidance and give us some feedback. So unless you say otherwise, please give me permission to add your email list to the group of stakeholders who could have a sneak preview of the guidance and give me some feedback before we actually go live and put it out to the public. So yes, that's something exciting coming up. So right, so I've said my bit, so back to Richard for part 2. Thanks, Richard.
Right, thanks, Mel. Okay, I just, as Mel says, highlighting a bit more on Devon as far as we can. Just thought this image was great because it just shows the incredible diversity and complexity of Devon's varied landscapes. I'm just highlighted this enhance and evolve kind of approach. I've heard it a few times. I don't know if it's replacing a conserve and enhance, but someone's commented on it already. So I think it's just the key message is landscape is going to be significant landscape change, and you know, we need to ensure that it not only meets the targets, but it is of a quality that is going to inspire people, provide people with economic benefit and great benefit for nature recovery, climate sequestration, and so on. So the other point I was going to make at the beginning is as I've gone through this, I'm just highlighting the fact that enclosure seems to be such an important factor, as well as landform. But I also wanted to pick out emerging species because I was involved in a case a couple of years ago, and I know there's a lot more about a rather unfamiliar palette of trees for more productive woodland based on climate change. And then also, again, just talk a lot about spirit of place and unity. So hopefully all aware of national character area profiles. They're so useful, particularly for me in lockdown when you can't get out and about like I used to, see things firsthand. And this was the image I was describing a bit earlier on that really does highlight how the plateau tops are incredibly open with very large fields. And just looking at the image, you probably will want to see a lot more woodland down at the river level because it's very nice to have that variety, the sort of ancient coombe woodland and then diversity along the rivers perhaps. But you know, woodland on the tops there would potentially, if it's well designed, fit in quite well. So this is the case, and I talked about the landscape context plan, that it's an output required by in fact the Woodland Creation Planning Grant, so it fulfills the UKFS requirement to consider landscape context. So yeah, this is, as you can see, on an OS base. The site's in the middle, where it says steep slope, and it's just picking out in really simple terms. It could be a lot more detailed than this, but looking at the OS map, you can see there's not a lot of woodland, generally speaking, in most of that image, most of that map. But where you have got woodland, you've got the sort of typical and iconic woodland in the combes along the watercourse there. You've got quite a lot of ornamental species associated with parkland and sort of grand house, I think it is, where we're familiar with seeing redwoods and cedars and that kind of thing. And then there is one, I assume, quite traditional block of productive woodland that is in fact mixed to the northwest of the site. But otherwise, the open plateau, you know, it's very open farmland with very few areas of woodland. But this particular site was very prominent. It was quite a steep slope on the edge of that plateau. This is a horrible little sketch, but what I wanted, the reason I'm showing it is because the sort of the site is in red, but you've got two bits of it really. You've got that very steep, prominent slope on the north side, and then you've got the flatter part of the plateau with some enclosure. And if nothing else, that picks out the two characteristics of the site that are very relevant to the woodland proposal. On the steep slope, not surprisingly, you've got a lot of existing woodland, but you've also, because it's less intensive farmland, in fact it's pasture, you've still got the enclosure pattern, and you've got a lot of regeneration and scrub, structural diversity. It's a sort of place that I think the cell bunting in the area, it's actually very visible from footpaths and from the local settlement, and it's on the northern edge of the AONB, so it's got almost like a sort of gateway feel to it. So that's the first point. The second point is, and this is a really key point for Devon, is that there's a whole new palette of climate resilient tree species, as I mentioned, being highlighted in ESC, so that you know, the trees are resilient and will be productive in 2050, 2080. So you know, this current landscape is on the whole, there's very familiar and typical tree species, you know, which is very much part of the distinctiveness and the character. So this particular scheme, there was a huge emphasis on basically taking every possible tree that would grow on that site and be a valuable productive species that you could get. So I know diversity is a good thing, generally speaking, but there is such a thing as over diversity, certainly from a visual point of view. So in this scheme there were coast redwoods, western red cedar, eucalyptus, walnut, you know, a lot of trees that sort of you wouldn't be out of place in the ornamental parkland to the west, but there's a bit of a jarring when it's next to the more familiar elements of the landscape. So I just wanted to flag that, because clearly we're in a very southerly part of the country, and you know, very mild climate, plenty of rain generally. So it's, if you like, there's a lot of visual change in the trees that are planted. Funnily enough, in the break, I was just thinking, because I do know Devon reasonably well, and I remember last time I came down a year or so ago, I was struck by the amount of bear's breeches growing in the hedgerows around Salcombe, and Devon does have quite a lot of sort of naturalised flora that kind of reflects its close to subtropical climate. So that just came into my mind, and in a way, the potential palette, the widening palette of resilient tree species may be just a reflection of that. Maybe this term evolution, you know, is is relevant here. I mean, in Hampshire, they're planting olive trees where I live, new housing estates, they plant olive trees in the middle of roundabouts, and they've been there 5 years. So I think it just reinforces the fact that you know, our landscape is changing, and some of that is because, well, a lot of that is because of the climate is changing as well. So to some extent we have to, well, to a full extent we have to kind of recognise that. But nevertheless, in design terms and fitting this new woodland into a site like this, you know, there are lots of issues, and that's where the design principles are very helpful. So this is walking along a public footpath. So the site is just top right side of the image. So you can see you've got you know, steeper slope with the whole range. Structurally, it's strikingly different heights. Bit of regeneration. You know, it's a nice typical Devon composition. Lots of red campion in the hedge. So I'm just, you know, again, I'm saying it's an area of high landscape and visual sensitivity in a designated landscape character, and it's how this new palette of trees might fit in, or maybe in this case it's just actually so prominent and iconic that it's not right, or those trees are actually, you know, the front face, the north facing area is not part of the scheme, and the more unfamiliar woodland, mixed woodland, is more integrated behind that woodland, so it's less potentially visibly intrusive. Tulip tree is the other species that was considered for here. So going back to pattern of enclosure, thanks Mel and others who sent some Devon photographs to me. I didn't have access to my computer, so I didn't have photographs I was intended to use. So I thought it was quite nice to have a bit of black and white in this presentation. But I think what I like this image is it shows, you know, a variety of different enclosure patterns. In the middle of the image, you've got this planned, very geometric pattern of enclosure, whereas this side of the central woodland, it's a lot more organic, and I imagine, you know, an ancient enclosure pattern. So the obvious thing to say there is that you've got what looks like quite a large area of woodland beyond maybe a railway line or a route of a straight road, and then you've got the existing patch in the middle of the bird's eye view. So from a landscape planning point of view, you can imagine new woodland connecting those two areas of woodland, and maybe however, of course, the other factor is that might be a lot more economically productive woodland, farmland, you know, so there's so many other factors, but just from an initial view. Another great image I was sent, and apart from it just sums up, I think this is East Devon, looks like East Devon. It's striking to me that the more extensive woodlands tend to be on the high ground, and whether if these patterns in different parts of different landscape character areas, you know, that's obviously something to respond to. Again, a borrowed photograph that caught my eye. So it's North Devon, and there is a pattern of enclosure, a bit smaller as you get near the settlement, and then you've got the plateau, larger, more recent enclosure, larger scale fields. So I thought about, if you were considering where new woodland might go, one option would be the mid slopes, where you've got the smaller field pattern, where, you know, it's set back from the settlement, but it links into some interesting existing woodland. But the tops, the more visible tops, are left open. And then, of course, the other one is to create woodland on those hilltops where there's bigger scale. It's very, very similar to, in the UKFS, they highlight that the detail and the smaller scale elements of any new large scale woodland will be in the valleys, lower down the valleys, close to settlement, that kind of thing. And then as you get higher up, that's where you have much larger scale woodland. So, and I felt that actually just by doing this simple exercise, it just does give quite a bit more diversity within the landscape character. I mean, I know this isn't a viewpoint. This will be from an aerial, maybe a drone or something, but it just, I think it's just interesting just to see how actually in this particular case woodland could enhance landscape character. And we've got both, we've got mixed woodland there, so how conifers can blend with broadleaves to create a new multifunctional type of woodland in North Devon. Okay, so this is in South Devon. Afraid it's not a great image, and for some reason I seem to have sliced off part of the slide. But this is a really important place. It's just outside Dartmouth. Well, you can see Dartmouth and the River Dart. A really important focus for tourism in South Devon, and really beautiful and very popular place indeed. And again, this pattern of coombe woodlands are quite very much a feature of the River Dart. So just about, hopefully just about make out some sort of grey blue shapes just to the top of the slide there. And this is a proposed scheme that some of you will be familiar with. And I just wanted to pull out a few points. We're obviously looking at this at landscape, coarse grain scale. And at a glance, what's striking is, you haven't got geometric, the shape of the compartments. You can see 3, there are actually 4, are quite well integrated into that landscape. They're not big blocks, they're not very regular. Because the field pattern is quite diverse, and because they're fitting into spaces in between the woodland, on the whole that looks quite sympathetic. But if you look a bit closer, I don't know if you can see it, but underneath the grey tone, you can see there is quite a bit of diversity in those compartments. There's existing hedges and field boundaries, there's mature trees. I noticed in the aerial photograph there's quite a lot of regenerating scrub, and on steep slopes, again, I know this is very important for things like the cell bunting, which is obviously an iconic species in South Devon, and this OMB in particular. So as well as semi improved and species rich grassland. So I suppose what I'm saying is that when I review these cases, and when we look at new woodland creation, there's the different scales of considering. And I think one of the challenges is that you have intensive farmland that is economically viable, and then you have those areas of grounds on typically like this on the edge of woodland that are far less intensive, and that's often where lots of woodland edge, existing woodland edge there, scrub, hedges, and that's often where there's not only that sort of more smaller scale, more intimate scale, is where there's a lot of wildlife, very important for nature recovery. There's footpaths through here. It's a sort of scale that people like a lot, particularly in such a scenic area. So I think there's a tension there as well. Plus the fact, it's kind of, particularly if you're going along the river, you get good views of quite a mosaic kind of landscape. There's quite a lot of existing woodland. So I think this kind of woodland clearly has to be done very sensitively. Unfortunately, I haven't visited the site and haven't been able to have a close look. But definitely got potential, but I think it needs a high level of analysis and site appraisal and so on. And in fact, there is going to be a landscape character assessment of a high level, so there will be a lot of consideration of the landscape context and the site itself. Right, I just thought it was important to break out of the sort of more enclosed part of Devon, and just look at the other very significant area of landscape in the middle of the county that is incredibly iconic and atmospheric and dramatic, and of course incredibly important from a tourism point of view. This again is a borrowed slide that immediately caught my eye, and I think what's interesting about it is it just captures quite a few key points about the landscape. You appear to have a lot of maybe birch and willow, relatively recent regenerating woodland, which actually, you know, fits very well. Possibly because of the time of year this was taken, maybe at the end of the summer, the areas that aren't covered in trees towards, I think that's Haytor or one of the key tors in Dartmoor, you can see the ground looks incredibly grey, it's very, very short, which of course highlights the incredible rocky landform. But you know, it's just quite a striking image, and I'm very interested in this because I think the unthinkable. This is I'm a very keen naturalist and bird watcher, and I'm keen on woodland and woodland edge birds in particular. And this is a place, when I can travel, I go to regularly on an annual basis, and it's just south of Paris in the Forest of Fontainebleau. And you know, the fact it's got such an abundance of wildlife, it's striking. But there's lots of other things. A lot of people look at this and think it's possible, if it's in England, it's possibly the New Forest, and it's not that far away. And in fact, they do have a link. There's a link between the New Forest and the Forest of Fontainebleau. But it's good just to analyse this image, because as you probably know, Forest of Fontainebleau is a huge ancient hunting forest just south of Paris. And you get these amazing sandstone ridges, and they have these huge, pretty sure they're sandstone outcrops. People go climbing on them. They're that significant. So a bit like Dartmoor, you've got these rocky features, but unlike Dartmoor, they're all in continuous canopy forestry, which, as you can see, is mixed. I mean, it's mainly pine with broadleaves, variety of pines, but they, you know, they're on these sort of ridges, the high ground. But the central point is that open space is actually a lens of somewhere I'd not heard of before, called Brie limestone, and it was subject to a bit of excavation over the years, but it has very important steppe flora, and also avifauna. But what I want to highlight really is that this is a huge scale forest, and there is an appropriately large scale open space that reflects the different geology and that scale of forest. So I think it has a very strong spirit of place, and I think it's because we don't have much forest like this or this kind of character currently in this country. It's always good to see just across the channel what's happening there and what has, you know, evolved there, if you like, and what a new large-scale multifunctional forest might look like. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying this is all part of the debate. So unlike the typical parts of Devon that are very, if you like, often geometric, but you know, in that framework of enclosure, this is, I don't know if I mentioned earlier on, but in the UKFS they highlight the importance of deciding whether it's pattern of enclosure or landform that are going to be the factors that most influence woodland character. So clearly this isn't pattern of enclosure, this is landform with these two parallel ridges and an area between that's limestone. So yeah, I think this has got a strong spirit of place. It demonstrates a lot of diversity. There's some really good natural processes happening. There's hawthorn scrub that's heaving with nightingales, for example, and redback shrikes. And then you have, you know, more of a broadleaf fringe, and then you go into mixed forest that, as I say, is continuous canopy. So I'm not suggesting Dartmoor will look like this by 2080, but I'm just flagging this up just to sort of highlight, give a bit of a sense of vision, because the other thing I would like to say is just in the last 2 weeks in my various meetings in the Forestry Commission, the amount of people in different sort of parts, or sometimes external people, that are talking about visioning and the vision, what's the new woodland going to look like, you know, is incredible. And obviously, as a landscape architect, your ears prick up at that. But also, I think, you know, the public, you know, in general, and all people involved in woodland creation just need to look at various options. Okay, so I think I've probably said enough about this, apart from the fact that it demonstrates quite well all the design principles, or, you know, it's quite a good, yeah. So actually, this is my final slide. I think perhaps I can't quite remember when we're due to finish, but I thought it would be, you know, very useful to allow plenty of time for the discussion. So really, I've just flagged up the different sorts of enclosure and how, well, one thing I didn't say about the enclosure is, well, about woodland design in general, is the perspectives of seeing it in a landscape context, from a distance, from a viewpoint, or from a balloon, a bird's eye kind of perspective. But also how it's viewed when you're just outside it, you're beside it. And then also how, also very important, of course, is how it feels like when you're inside. So I think designing more traditionally, the approach to woodland design has been external. So it's all been less about the site, but much more about how it's viewed from key points, you know, a mile or two away, or whatever. But I think we need to take a holistic approach to that. So just going to finish by saying, just reiterating the resources that are currently available. So within the UKFS, as I mentioned, there's 7 key elements of sustainable forest management, and forest and landscape is one of them, which also has a lot to say about woodland design. But in reality, the woodland design embraces all those remaining elements. So that's an important point. Something I haven't mentioned yet, there is a sort of a supporting document called Design Techniques for Forest Management, published by the Forestry Commission, that is probably about 5 years old now. That's a slightly misleading title, actually, because it's just as appropriate as a source of design techniques for woodland creation. And although it's quite wordy and quite a long document, there are some good elements to it that are still very relevant. So they're both easily available on if you search for them online. The other thing I'd like to emphasize is myself and my new colleague, who's soon to start, will be working as a priority on a layer of sort of detailing and guidance that will go into much more detail, like looking at how you integrate woodland into enclosures. We're also looking at topics, particularly like getting edge treatments right for access, internal and external edge treatment, potentially how to make more modest scale of woodland UKFS compliant, and, you know, actually getting some really important stuff easily available. And then the other thing I'd say is this, you know, look at this as a bit of an introduction and a bit of a opportunity for a discussion above all, but I I do more detailed landscape training courses between half a day and a day, looking at specific elements. And before lockdown, obviously that would involve sometimes be based around a site in particular, and you know, face to face, and lots of drawing exercises are a lot more engaging and hands-on, which unfortunately is very difficult to do online. So that's always a possibility for all audiences. Okay, so I'd strongly recommend those, and well, that's all I've got to say at the moment. So perhaps it's good to end there and have further discussions if that's useful.
Thank you, Richard. You're way ahead of time, so that's fantastic. We have a bit of time. We were scheduling to start the discussion at about 12, so we've got plenty of time to talk through lots of questions and discussion points coming in. So I will start off with one about the something about the process in which we approach this topic. Siri Frost has asked about the consultation process. Siri.
Yep.
Siri, do you want to ask your question?
Sorry, I was busy writing lots of notes. Yeah, I just wanted, because obviously there is a lot more large scale woodland planting going on, and we're occasionally, at the Environment Agency, occasionally seeing some for consultation. It might be a part of the EIA process, and so I think personally I'm not familiar with the process of consultation for large scale woodland planting, and just wondered if you could just summarize that for us, if that's okay.
Okay, let me just think about this, because what my role is I'm in the policy advice team. So we have across the country area teams with woodland officers, but in more recent years there's a lot more, there's woodland creation officers, and Roland Stonex, who's on this in this meeting, is the one for Devon. And they are much more an intermediary between the landowner and the applicants and ourselves and the policy advice team. So let me just think about the consultation process. Yeah, because I'm not so directly involved with it, but I think the key thing is the outputs. The reason why there's these specified outputs, particularly the design concept plan, is that it gives, you know, they can be used at public meetings, particularly in woodlands that are close to settlement or public access, is a way of drawing people in and getting them to easily understand what's being proposed and asking the questions and potentially influencing and shaping the design. Because I have, in the past, there have been situations where there was a very large scheme where there was if you like, a forestry plan with lots of different colours and then little codes for different tree species. And this was used in a public consultation. It was just enlarged, so it was a huge poster that everyone could see. But of course, it was for the average person who didn't understand the codes and the significance of the colours, and there was no supporting landscape context or site appraisal information. It made no sense at all for any consultation or any. So and that scheme took a long time to develop and get implemented, and that was one of the reasons why they just pretty well ignored UKFS. So yeah, these are really the design concept plan, ideally with a couple of options, is the key tool for consultation.
Roland,
but I don't know what, Sarah, sorry, just finally, I don't know if you're involved with NIAS at all, but I know I've got some previous colleagues who work in NIAS, including landscape architects, so they would be, if you have any questions about that kind of thing and about the design process, I'm sure they'll be able to give you a lot of information and explain a bit more detail.
Thank you, Richard. Yeah, I know Pamela Morris is on the training as well. So yeah,
so she would be excellent for that. Yeah.
Richard, Roland's got his hand up. I don't know, Roland, was that about that point?
Well, it's just to follow that up. Hi, Siri. Quite a few of you know me already. I'm Roland Stonex, Woodland Creation Officer. I cover most of Devon, not all of Devon. It's quite complicated. To try and answer your question quickly, Siri, it's quite complicated process, and I think it's possibly fair to say we don't perhaps state it explicitly externally, and it is under review. The process is under review at the moment. It depends. I deal mainly with the large scale woodland creation schemes. There is a slightly streamlined process for smaller ones. So there is a statutory consultation process that would happen with any large scheme. The idea of the and who we would consult depends on where the site is and what designations apply to the site or are nearby the site. I'd be happy to have a separate meeting with you and go through it in more detail, perhaps with some specific sites in mind, rather than taking up a lot of time today. The woodland creation process, the design process that Richard's outlining, is aimed at getting all of that concern and issues identified and discussed, and a way forward agreed between all relevant stakeholders, taking into account landscape, biodiversity, historic environment, obviously the landowner's objectives. Are the trees actually going to grow? Economic objectives, taking all of that together. So yeah, I'd be happy to pick up pick up that on a sort of more specific basis with you afterwards.
Thank you. That'd be good. Thank you, Roland.
Thank you. And just while we're on the subject of processes, Kath Statham, you've got a question about that, an LVIA. Are you there?
Oh, right, yeah.
Yes, I am, thank you. I'm a landscape architect with Cornwall Council. Thank you for letting us come and piggyback on the Devon training. I was just interested when you were talking earlier on at the beginning, you were mentioning about evaluation and looking at the site context, and you mentioned GLVIA, and I wondered whether you actually do ensure or that in large scale planting and management that you have got a landscape architect involved, and whether you do actually say that you are going to follow GLVIA.
Okay, thank you ever so much. That's a really good question and something I forgot to mention. Things might well change, but in the 5 years I've been at Forestry Commission, there's been very few EIAs and formal environmental what are they called? Environmental statements. So, and to be honest, one of the key ones that comes to mind was a partial LVIA, in as far as it was looking at a large site from external viewpoints and, basing the whole of the assessment on that. It didn't really, so I was concerned about that. And I think there was a tradition of, in terms of landscape in the Forestry Commission, the things that people most, people that have been around a while, most are familiar with are visual force analysis, which was developed very early on, particularly in Scotland, for looking at the land, getting people that were proposing woodlands to think about the landform rather than just the sort of site boundaries, and also LVIA. That's something that people, but what it does is it kind of, that kind of partial approach to LVIA reinforced the fact that landscape is about looking from a distance. There's a woodland a mile in that direction, in that valley or on that hill. So what I've done is, because the huge majority of schemes had no proper landscape character assessment, so they weren't in accord with UKFS in that respect. So I've worked with Chris Bolton from Natural England, and more recently I've had conversations with Caris Swanwick, because she's been involved in the UKFS review, I'm very pleased to say. And so what I'm developing is if to use the term fit for purpose landscape character appraisal, and that's really a local landscape character assessment of the site and the site context. So but it's based on the GLVIA, and it's an informal piece of work. It's not formal for an EIA process, because, as I say, that's quite rare. It might be there might be more coming along, but it's, up to now, it's quite rare. So, as I say, this landscape character appraisal, is in three. Well, we're working on three categories at the moment. So, bear in mind that a lot of this work isn't done by landscape professionals currently. So, for the more low risk and medium risk, capturing these basic elements of landscape character and so on, it is extremely important, but it might not be that complex or that detailed. So that's the way we're currently doing things. And the third point is, there's a lot of, not surprisingly, there's a lot of interest in the landscape, recent interest in the landscape profession in woodland expansion and tree planting and that kind of thing. Well, it has been with tree planting, but with woodland expansion. So I have a sort of a woodland landscape professional network, and I've been just the sole landscape architect in the Forestry Commission. So although I've been going around the country doing training and upskilling, it's really very challenging to do it at sufficient scale to get really make a culture change. So I've got a small working group looking at exactly how we can upskill landscape professionals in the UKFS woodland design principles and process, plus all the other associated guidance, and then what we're currently producing. So that's one thing we're doing, and then we're also looking at how to get the landscape profession to work more effectively with the forestry sector. And there was a Landscape Matters online debate recently where the president of the ICF was chairing the meeting, and it was one of the outcomes that is decided to work a lot more closely between the landscape profession, Landscape Institute, the Institute of Chartered Foresters, and potentially having a combined event to sort of increase awareness of the value and so on. And that could ideally include groups like the Woodland Trust, so that there's a better kind of better informed and better connected cross-sector group that can all work together for much better woodland creation, ticking all the complex objectives and resolving those issues. So sorry, that's quite a long-winded answer, but hopefully does that make sense?
Helpful, thank you.
That sounds like a good thing, Richard, and I hope this this event and others will start building that momentum and the network of people who are engaged in this, especially the landscape consultants who, we've been focusing maybe too much on development, whereas the big challenges are sort of coming through from the land management and land use change aspects of proper landscape planning. So yeah, that's reinvigorating that sector of the landscape profession, I think. And on that point, we've had a comment from thinking about what the landscape profession are doing at the moment. Sally, you've got something that you wanted to tell people about in the chat about visualizations. I know that that's obviously a core bit of a core tool really to help share the vision of what the landscape will look like in the future, and we've certainly been using that with Fiona Fife in our Right Place Right Tree guidance, and I know Tim Youngs in the Black Downs has been working with an illustrator to do that as well in terms of the wider potentially wider implications of nature recovery as well. So it's not just about woodland creation, it's just about how the landscape will change. So Sally, do you want to just tell us about what you're doing in Exmoor and who you're from? Yeah.
Yep. Hi, I'm Sally Marshall from LEC Land Use Consultants. So in terms of why I'm here today, done a lot of work in Devon on landscape character assessment and landscape sensitivity assessment, and generally at LEC, like the recent comment, we're starting to be asked to look more strategically and help clients think strategically about new tree and woodland planting and nature recovery in general. So I'm currently working, for example, for Bath and North East Somerset Council on a landscape sensitivity assessment for woodland and tree planting there. But the example I just put in the chat, local to here, is we've just completed work with FWAG Southwest, looking at creating some visualizations for tree and woodland planting, but also not just planting, looking at enhancing hedgerows, letting things allowing natural succession in an area of North Devon along the coast within Exmoor National Park. So quite an open landscape, quite exposed. So it would be quite a change, but we were really trying to focus on how to enhance and strengthen those patterns and add to the existing patterns rather than anything completely new. Plus it's, you know, it's a nationally designated landscape as well. So that's one project, and we've so in doing that we had some photographs taken, current photographs of the landscape, and then we've used techniques within we've actually used a computer program to visualize new woodland using computer techniques within the image. So we've got some images looking at how that landscape, the same landscape, would look over a time series. And just started the same. We're just waiting for the trees to come in leaf. We're now working with Exmoor National Park Authority themselves to look at a couple of locations above Simmons Bath. People know that location, which is under their ownership. They're quite keen to explore what they can do on their own land and use that as an engagement tool. So yeah, just thought I'd share those. I can't share my screen and show you because they're work in progress, and FWAG haven't publicly made theirs available yet, but hopefully we'll be able to share those in the near future. So that was it.
Thank you, Sally. Okay, so are there any more questions about process before we go on to another topic? Okay, so there's another interesting question or comment really that's come up about historic field patterns, and I know we kind of touched on this in the first Q&A session, but I think it would be worth delving into this because that is obviously a very important part of Devon's character. So Rupert, you've asked a question about historic field patterns. Would you like to ask that question?
Hi. Yeah, no, it's it's prime for all of Devon almost. It seems these key small old farms, small still barriers of hedges, and should we be thickening up those hedges, or creating to improve the habitat linkage, or just small copses, or it's very difficult to sort of envisage how to sit a decent sized woodland in that landscape without breaking it up into lots of small woodlands, or perhaps that's what we should be doing.
Well, yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it also just prompted me to say that in the policy advice team I have a regular meeting with my biodiversity and historic environment colleagues. And I think after doing this presentation and realizing a little bit more about the importance of the fill patterns in Devon, I'm going to raise that at that next meeting, because obviously, as you say, there's a historic environment aspect to it that's really relevant. Sorry, I've just slightly forgotten your question.
Well, when can I just break in? But there was also another point made by Leslie, kind of related to that, about ancient and veteran trees. I don't know if you're there still, Leslie.
Hello, I'm Leslie Strong, Tamar Valley AONB, but I've also got my Cornwall Ancient Tree Forum hat on for this one. I think it's really just noting that if there are ancient and veteran trees within a planting area, just to be aware of overshadowing and the effects of planting. And regularly going out and recording and verifying old trees. There's a lot of trees that were, they originally show very much a sense of how they've grown in an opening environment and reflect their shape and their structure, but they're now within, some of them are within younger plantations, and that's actually beginning to overshadow and cause some issues. So it's just another one to add to the mix, really.
Yeah, can I just say I think that's an extremely important point, and the design principle scale really relates to that, and it also applies to hedgerows and footpaths. Leaving adequate scale of space available to retain these important features, and also obviously bearing in mind the extension over the life of, if it's a productive woodland or more of a permanent woodland. Just consider the scale of the lateral extension of those trees in relation to some of these very sensitive features. But the other thing I'd say is this is exactly what I hopefully been talking about earlier on, the importance of highlighting these really important features within a woodland creation site, giving them adequate scale of space, but also fitting them into the overall design of the woodland. So the logical thing, if you had some really excellent veteran oak trees in the middle of your site, would be to incorporate that into the open space system. So you're not just avoiding them, you're actually making them a sort of a highlight in the middle of in the woodland. Actually making them a feature that if there's public access, it gives a very distinct human scale sense of place. And then it's connected, with an open space system to other elements, habitats, hedgerows. And I think that's exactly. So what I'm really trying to say is, when you start with a site, you create that framework. You see where the ancient trees are, the grassland of value, a bit of wetland, hedgerows, other existing trees, and you sort of see if you can connect them all, and then that will actually identify the compartments that are particularly good for, say, productive woodland or more closed canopy woodland. But there's a lot of synergies between access, biodiversity, historic environment, and the aspect of connectivity is really, really important. So they shouldn't be seen in isolation, the veteran trees, but they should be hugely valued, and that's exactly the sort of thing I would always pick up, actually, when I comment on cases. And I'm very aware that they need a lot of space and light to be retained as a feature. But that's a really good point. Thanks for mentioning it.
Well, while we're on the subject of edges and openness, Simon Pryor, you've got a question about margins. Would you like to ask that?
Thanks. Yeah, sorry to dive in as part of your background, Richard, which is rather nice looking open
Oh,
woodland.
thank you.
And,
I'll talk about that in a minute if you don't mind.
But no, I mean, classic sort of forest design was a lot about managing edges, and a lot of the English landscape is very much, you know, sharp boundaries between woodland and fields. And whilst, you know, respecting that in an enclosed landscape feels right, particularly on the moorland edge or up on the moorland, you know, the fuzzy boundaries, the dynamic sort of nature of woodland interplaying with other wetland or moorland habitats feels like it's a much better solution, but surprisingly difficult to achieve, you know, on the ground. And also doesn't, you know, it doesn't often fit into people's plans or grant scheme rules very well. So I just wondered how we can encourage and enable more of that.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks so much for that question, because it's on my mind all the time, really, actually, because, you know, obviously with a productive stand of trees, you know, you're going to want them in, you're going to want good yields, you're going to want them in lines, you know, it's very important to get all that kind of detailing right. But, you know, we're now talking about, you know, a certain percentage of the woodland being a lot more naturalistic. And I live in Hampshire and sort of North Hampshire, and the places that inspire me just visually, because you can see natural processes happening, and certainly from a wildlife point of view, and all the, you know, all those benefits you get for health and well-being, you know, they're the places where you've got these more natural kind of woodlands, if you like. Now, you know, there's a lot more talk in the Forestry Commission about natural colonisation throughout, and rewilding. So I think increasingly areas for natural colonisation are being, you know, part of applications, and I think the grant system and elms and so on might have better recognition of that. But as a landscape architect, I know over the years when I've been, I suppose, creating more things like school grounds or more parks, sort of more naturalistic parks, you know, with landscape contractors, you can design woodland that's mimicking natural processes. For example, in the New Forest and in areas of grazing near me, where I live, you know, you get thorn thickets develop with blackthorn, hawthorn, and create domes, if you like, and then the oak and field maple and other things that aren't thorny just grow within that. So you've got quite a distinctive pattern, and you know, that's how nature protects trees and creates that mosaic that I think humans and wildlife find so interesting, because and valuable because there's so much edge and the scale is good. So obviously for new woodland, well, if it's near settlement, for example, to get communities, I mean, I've been involved in an environment agency working on big scale flood management schemes where we extended out into, if you like, the green infrastructure or the green area to you know, create a lot of valuable habitat mosaic. And we would get communities involved to in planting both wetland species in water bodies, but also trees and shrubs, to create just the kind of random kind of planting that you'd expect to see with natural regeneration, planting trees on their side or in multi-stem groups, or, you know, in high numbers, and then expect some to be lost over time, or, you know, so you've got more naturalness. So obviously with large scale forests, that's a bit more difficult, but there's a lot of talk now about innovation and different ideas at this particular time. And I think for me, that's something I'm going to be flagging up a lot more. And I must come back, I'm glad you noticed that place behind me, because I live near Odium Common, that was one of the most important areas of wood pasture going back a couple of hundred years. And it's now a very closed canopy oak and largely oak and hazel, oak, hazel and holly. But what they've done very creatively, because local people didn't want them to open it up into wood pasture again, they like the trees, but over about 10 years, they've been working on a few really good glades where they've kind of selectively, quite like good scale, but they've selectively taken out oaks and other trees, you know, and they've highlighted things like aspen, light demanding species, hawthorn, alder buckthorn, you know, birch, willows, all this kind of diversity, but it's in a kind of much more of a, almost, you know, like an open, it's like wood pasture habitat, but lots of different structures. And also from a historic point of view, there's brick earth at this site. So you've got quite a few small ponds and pools. So this place, there's no car park there. So it's a very, from a people point of view, underused, but quite large piece of woodland. But it's got these fantastic clearings that you just stumble across, and they're just heaving with wildlife and natural beauty and interesting shaped trees, open grown trees. And, you know, it has a huge appeal to me. But I think I discussed this with Chris Bolton in Natural England, showed him some photographs. And I think it could be quite a useful case of obviously how the value of good management and good objectives, but also how you can design that kind of diversity in new woodland, you know, and maybe, although a lot of the new woodland will be done, implemented in a more conventional way, there's got to be a lot of scope to have nodes and the entrances and within the woodland to have that kind of clearing I showed you in Fontainebleau, you know, the right scale, lots of diversity and lots of trees that you know are much more inspiring and interesting in terms of shape and naturalness.
I think that's a good point to ask another question, which Debbie raised, and well, just a comment really, and Charlotte picking up on going back to the exotic species debate.
Yes, good one.
And you know the concern about eucalyptus, for example, and the wildlife, the risk to wildlife if you know we do embrace the ESC tool too enthusiastically. And there was also a specific question about the ESC. Is that list being updated anytime soon? That was a question from Debbie, I think.
Oh, well, I think the answer to that is it's quite up to date actually, because it yeah, I'm sure it's been worked on in the last couple of years, and I must admit I haven't really used it myself, but you know, you can put in all the information about your location, and then it'll just give you a suite of species that are, you know, very suitable in 2050 2080, and then species that will be completely unsuitable by that time as well. So, for example, beech is an example of a tree that will be a lot less suitable for southern England. Although, actually, having said that, I was recently involved in a large scheme on the South Downs with a lot of the what we call emerging species, and there was a lot of beech planted within it as a framework, but it was also supplemented with hornbeam that I think is a more resilient species, but otherwise quite similar to beech. So yeah, it doesn't need to be updated. I think it's pretty well up to date. And the other thing that I expect you're aware of is the use of seed from other parts of Europe that are you know, also being even in native woodlands. I think a third of the seed will be sourced from, I think it's 3 degrees south of wherever you are. So if you're in the north of Scotland, it would probably be seed sourced in southern England, but from the south of England, including Devon, it would be somewhere around the Loire Valley, for example. You know, just to add to that resilience. But I mean, I think these are really interesting. I mean, the other discussion occasionally is assisted migration even within native woodlands, and I am doing a short training session with the landscape professionals involved in High Speed 2 in the near future, and I think actually there's quite a bigger debate to be had
about, you know, this blending of resilience and landscape character, and, you know, where, I mean, you probably wouldn't want to, if you were expanding Wistman's Wood, you probably wouldn't want to put in Holm Oak in the mix, just because for obvious reasons. So there is a lot of, again, I think it's a really good example of foresters, ecologists, landscape architects, you know, all people involved to, you know, have some sort of more coordinated response, because it's such an interesting issue. I mean, I know the Forestry Commission are working hard with Natural England in the uplands, balancing peat and the importance of peat and wading birds and woodland creation. You know, that's another big discussion. And but in the same way, I think, I mean, in the scheme in the South Downs, you know, and the south of England, sequoia or coast redwoods are trees of ornamental grand houses, or occasionally in parks. But if you can imagine them coming out into as a landscape scale forestry species in designated landscapes, they have to be very carefully designed in. And that's not just planting them with, surrounding them with beech, we're just picture framing them with beech. It's actually emphasizes why good design based on these principles I've been talking about, and using landform and so on, and working with silvicultural experts, because I think there is a risk that ESC, one thing I didn't mention is the difference between taking a site and avoiding things, like avoiding the veteran trees, put them in a circle in a woodland, and proper design, proper woodland design. You know, woodland design is about taking everything together. It's about this integrated approach, not just avoidance. And there has been a tradition of just, well, there's a scheduled ancient monument, we won't go within 10 metres of that. There's an important hedgerow or veteran tree, we'll put a ring around that. So you can't, previously you were ending up with, you know, a piece of land and then blobs of open ground or features not planted on, but otherwise no other connection. And obviously everyone knows that's not a sensible, that's a bad thing to do now. So they're just such relevant, important questions in woodland design. But coming back to things like eucalyptus again, you know, if these trees are climate change resilient and they're productive and economically viable, they're going to be planted at scale in places, you know. And so in some places there's going to be a real objection and maybe it's not going to happen, but in a lot of places it is. And the key thing is good design and planning so that it's integrated into our changing landscape in as beneficial way as possible. And
yeah,
I think,
I
you know what I
agree.
mean? I think it's going to happen. We just need to be there to make sure it's done as well as possible. You know, landscape's always been changing, and it'll change. The pace of change will just be faster than we.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Richard. And you know, we're all about guiding and managing that landscape change, aren't we? So we can have multiple benefits, and that includes for people and wildlife.
Absolutely.
So I just want to, I'm just conscious we've got about 15 minutes left. Just want to end on one last question, which is really more of a wider debate. We touched on it in the first bit, but Norbert asked this question, or just highlighted that he just felt, well, Norbert, you'd like to say your question about the tension between the planting targets we have and this perception that we want to preserve the landscape like it is, and then leading on from that, being clear on what's of value, what we do need to protect and what we can change, so we get that right balance between what is conserved and what is evolved. So Norbert, would you like to expand on your comment that you made?
Hello there.
Yeah,
I'm
hi.
not, but I'm with Prime Ricket Silviculture, mainly in the southwest. The question is, I think, quite straightforward. 30,000 hectares in this country, where are we going to put them without having a significant instantaneous impact on the landscape? How are we trying to fit in? Simple as that. I don't know the solution.
Okay, well, 30,000 is UK, but so England is less than that. But what I will say is I think it's at least 4 times the rate of tree planting that the previous or existing targets are, and we weren't anywhere near those existing targets. So I have heard 7 times the amount of tree planting and woodland creation. But you know, it's balancing lots of things, and we all know why the reasons are and what the benefits are. But I think I mean, there's a lot of thinking, new thinking in the Forestry Commission. A lot of we've got a new head of strategy and policy in the Forestry Commission who's come from outside the forestry sector, and it's really interesting the debates we're having and how we're tackling that. So it's a very interesting time, and you're absolutely right. Where are the trees going to go, and what role will landscape character assessments and NCAs have? I think a key message is just effective collaborative working between a lot of different interested disciplines is going to be really essential, because the targets are fast paced. I think one of the key messages is good design is risk management, because I think because it's so highlighted and under so much scrutiny and there's so much expectation, if it isn't done well, there's going to be problems. It's either going to be the program's going to be slowed down. It's going to be much slower than it needs to be. There's going to be a lot more cost. There's going to be a lot more, bad press, if you like. So more than ever, it's essential to get this right and get good results and put the right trees in the right place, or getting the right trees in the right place. Or the other way.
It's worth highlighting something which Debbie and Lorna both highlighted in the chat, is also, the systems and processes we're going forward with is starting to value public goods, what nature does for us, and putting a measure on things. And unfortunately, the landscape and the perceptual and aesthetic qualities, arguably, they're difficult to measure, aren't they? So they perhaps get forgotten. So we shall await with interest what comes through from the ELM, what actually emerges from the tests and trials. And I do know that some farmers and landowners, they get the need to conserve the beauty of a place and why people value it, but it's not always easy to articulate.
This is such an important area. Yeah, such an important area, because obviously a lot of this is driven by climate change resilience and carbon sequestration, of course, but nature recovery is now becoming, is getting right up there in priority. But with the pandemic and the reliance most of us have had on our, nearby landscapes and that access to nature and naturalness, the importance for human health and well-being, I can see that really coming up, getting more significant, because I think, talking on a personal level, as you can sense, we want diverse landscapes and mosaics of all different things. They're all interesting and all have a place. But I think, I think the access to nature, I think that the kind of landscapes and the woodland edges and the woods that are a bit more
naturalistic, a bit more diverse, structurally diverse, of a good range of open space, edges, shrubs, different ages of tree, you know, that real structural and ecological diversity. They're the places in this country that really give, you know, great benefits to people, because you get incredible soundscapes of birds singing, wind in the trees. They're visually very diverse. You know, you can sense nature happening and doing its own thing to a degree. And I think that needs to be recognised. That, as you say, that Mel, I don't think it currently is. I don't think, you know, we've got to stop talking about woodland generically as just one thing, and talk about the whole spectrum of different kind of woodland characters that offer different services, you know, and different value to people. You know, like that clearing in Odin Common that I make a beeline for, because, you know, in simple terms, it brings me joy and it brings me stimulation. There's so many different levels to, you know, it's a sunny glade apart from anything else. Now the weather's warming up, that's wonderful, full of butterflies. So I think that's an important way forward, that link between nature recovery and human health and well-being, and you know, seeing the big picture, which is why I think the landscape approach is so essential.
Yes, I totally agree. The diversity, variety, and the contrasts, especially within Devon, and I think that was said right at the beginning. Maybe Charlotte mentioned that the small scale and intricate patterns we have that are so distinctive, and we need to be very clear on what's of value, because obviously we are going to be changing the landscape, and just to be clear on what we need to protect in all of that. I think going back to Norbert's question will be instrumental in that, and the clarity of that is a challenge, especially when it comes to the more less tangible things, like how you enjoy a place, how you recognize it, how you read it as a legible landscape. So very interesting debate going on. So I have come to the end of the questions that I've picked up. So we've just got a tiny bit of time left. If you do have any more questions, could you raise your hand, please? Oh, Simon, you've got a question. You're on mute.
Thanks, Melanie. Apologies, everyone. Now we're very focused on getting the design and species choice right for new woodland. I just wondered if we're putting enough emphasis on restocking and applying the same sort of rigor and standards. And it sometimes feels to me like we just repeat the mistakes of the past and continue with the same harsh boundaries or species choice or design.
Thank you so much for that question.
Whether we ought to put more emphasis on the same standards to restocking.
I'm really pleased you asked that question, because it's another point that I didn't mention earlier on. But I've just got the landscape, the forest and landscape section of UKFS in front of me, and I highlighted in particular the importance of taking account of landscape context, and I also highlighted the importance of the requirement of applying forest design principles. But what I didn't highlight was the fourth one under the landscape section, and it says this: where existing forests do not meet UKFS requirements for forest and landscapes, if improvements should be made when management opportunities arise. So when a forest is being restructured, it has to be, you know, what goes in its place and how it's managed has to be UKFS compliant. So standards, you know, there's the opportunity there to, you know, bring it up to current standards. And, you know, that's a requirement. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that would be great.
So that's a requirement number 4 in it. The section is 6.3 of the UKFS for forest and landscape, and the requirement is number 4. I don't know if people are aware that you in the UKFS you've got the top ones are legal requirements, and then you've got requirements. So there's no legal ones under landscape, but you've got requirements, and then the next level down, it's the guidelines. But in the case of landscape, the guidelines as 36 are extremely important because they explain how you can fulfill and meet the requirements. So it's not just a case of saying the guidelines are, you know, the third category, we can ignore them. They're actually fundamental for meeting requirements and legal requirements. So the thing I would like to sort of slightly end on from my point of view is the fact that the UKFS this is a more significant review, and I think there is a general understanding that it is a good document, but it hasn't been that well perhaps promoted and widely used. So I think the next version, or the amended version, might be a lot more punchy and a lot more specific and be updated to the, you know, there's been such a lot of change in the last 5 and certainly 10 years. So you know, I will be involved in the update, and but I, you know, I would just say that I think in the next year or so it should be reissued. But if people have any particular questions about more detailed aspects of the UKFS, then please, you can go via mail, and please contact me, and I can try and help answer it. But I mean, my closing point, I would say, is Devon really is such a special and interesting county for so many reasons. It's upland, got so much general diversity, the coast, the southerly aspect of it, and yeah, it's a delight. It's an amazing. Everyone knows Devon. It's just an amazing place, and I think yeah, it's just so important that the woodland expansion is in the right place and really does enhance it. And looking at some of those images of the upland plateaus, I can see there is opportunity for some quite exciting new woodland creation.
Thank you, Richard. I think we've just got one more question and then we'll wrap up. So Brian, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Richard.
Hi, Brian.
Yeah, Brian Elliott, Devon Forestry Consultants, and in support of what Simon Pryor talked about, it'd be quite good to see productivity and looking at the right tree in the right place and the right stocking, and to ensure that we don't repeat what we've done wrong in the past. And to a certain degree, in support of that, one of the things that I do is not just oak, but I look at eucalyptus trees, and I'm planting quite a few around all over the country. And in context, a lot of people don't view them as foreign tree. You look at the trees that are above Dartington, above Totnes, and the local people in Totnes think it's part of their environment, and they don't look upon them as as wrong. They look good in the landscape. They fit the landscape.
Yeah.
And most of the people in Totnes don't even know the eucalyptus.
That's so interesting. What's fascinating about landscape in general is that it is, you know, it's changing quite slowly, generally speaking, and we're comfortable and familiar with the landscape we kind of grow up in and see on a daily basis. When I was working for the Environment Agency, I did quite a lot of work in Lewisham and in some parks there, and it was really striking where there was a bit of space for trees to grow and prosper, you know, naturally, regeneration. The tree that was coming up and doing extremely well in the mild microclimate of South London was the holm oak. So, you know, that was obviously brought here, if you like, an assisted migration in the Victorian times or whenever as an ornamental tree. And it's essentially a Mediterranean oak tree that is naturalizing in, you know, I mean, Brownsea Island, the south side of Brownsea Island is covered with holm oak. So, you know, we're familiar with Budleigh, aren't we? There's so many trees that have come here because of our history, either been brought here artificially. We've got a climate we have that we've got a very wide range of trees that can grow well here. That includes obviously all the forestry species. I mean, there has been discussions about recreating ecologically authentic associations for forestry as to those growing on the northwest seaboard of North America. Well, that's already happening. Sitka spruce is one, western hemlock, Douglas fir. But actually, the ecologist for Forestry England, now retired, did some papers about, you know, recreating those. Now in Scotland, I think he was particularly talking about, or the west coast. But yeah, there's so many different factors and so many
Richard,
different
in support of that, I would do a lot of work with the giant sequoias in California, and with the giant sequoias, the one of their target areas in the world, one of the best places I've targeted to replace their environment is actually Wales, and we're looking at planting lots. They think that Wales is the best place on the earth that replicates their sort of environment. You know, one other little point I want to make is that we can't be too focused on species choice of the species we're going to have in 50 years' time. We need to plant what we can grow now. We don't want to plant trees that we can start planting in 50 years' time. So we've got to be careful about the tree species choice we've got and the environment that we've got at the moment currently.
Well, I think they're so fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I have heard from colleagues that, you know, going back a million plus years, you know, giant sequoias were growing on what is now the British Isles. I think someone said that.
Correct.
Yeah. So that's an interesting, very long-term perspective. And then a lot of people say, of course, we were cut off from Europe, so there was a lot of trees that just didn't get here naturally 10,000 years ago. But I think what I emphasise is the fact that Britain is a very diverse place for so many reasons, and the mosaic approach, you know, of having all these different treatments is probably quite a resilient one, and that includes the pleasure of going to a very semi-natural looking woodland, or, you know, going to a new climate resilient woodland in Wales with lots of giant sequoias. I mean, I'm sure that will become a tourist attraction in 100 years or something when they get huge.
I think that's a good point to stop on, and I'm conscious that some people are leaving because we've now reached the end. So I'm just going to say a huge thank you, Richard, for giving us a fascinating workshop, and also to those participating today who've joined this discussion and listened, and really good discussion points coming out and questions, and I hope you've enjoyed it too. So please do remember a very final point to fill in your feedback form, which is right at the beginning of the chat. And I really welcome any comments that have come through today. Richard bless him, is his first one in the whole country. We're a trial in Devon. So yeah, to use this new format, and I think it's worked quite well, apart from you know, the usual kind of hiccups we get all the way. But thank you very much for everybody for joining me today, and just remains to say you can go and have your lunch now. So thanks
so
very much.
For the great feedback and questions. It really is brilliant, because it's all just so useful.